Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last webinar. This is the last of our 5 webinar series of managing nature's resources in organic production under water-limited conditions. I'm Karen Clausen from the Manitoba Organic Alliance, or MOA, and I'm joining you from a very cold Treaty 1 territory, and land is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples in the homeland of the Métis Nation. So in addition to hosting this series of webinars, we also produce a podcast called Grain on the Brain. And in fact, we have our lovely host here today, Scott Beaton, who's going to be joining us as our guest. So we've just put out a recent episode on transitioning to organic. So check that one out, and we've got more in the pipeline. We're also hosting a bunch of workshops and a conference this winter. So check out our website, manitobaorganicaLalliance.com, and find out about our events and podcast. So our partner in bringing this webinar series to you is Dr. Martin Entz through the Natural Systems Agriculture Group at the University of Manitoba. I should mention that today what we're doing is we're talking about designing water smart farming systems, practical examples. So we have 2 farmers here talking to you about what they've done on their farms. So we want to thank our generous sponsors and our funders for helping to host this or provide this webinar. So we have FCC, Grain Millers, Manitoba Harvest, ProCert Organic, and TheoryMesh, who are our sponsors. And we have received grants from the Prairie Organic Development Fund, the Government of Manitoba, and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. So I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Martin Entz. At the end of this webinar, I'm going to show you, if you're an agronomist, a screen that you can QR code that you can click on, and you can get CCA credits for this. And the other thing is, because it's our last webinar, I would like to get some feedback from you guys. So I'm going to put a link in the chat at the end of this webinar, and you can provide some feedback for us. And I will hand it over to Dr. Entz.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm assuming you can hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, everyone, wherever you are or wherever you're listening. Today, I am broadcasting from the lovely Keystone Center in Brandon, Manitoba, and they've staged the podcast area with this really nice Christmas tree, so thanks to them. I'm really excited about today's webinar podcast because it gives us a chance to hear from farmers in terms of what they're doing to manage water on organic farms. So we have talked in the past about, we had a webinar from New Mexico under, really extreme drought conditions. We had a webinar on carbon and cover crops. We had a webinar on nitrogen, and we had a webinar last week on phosphorus. So today we're going to kind of tie it together with the farmers, and so I'm going to jump right into it. Our first farmer panelist is Stewart Wells of just outside of Swift Current, Saskatchewan, and Stewart is a longtime organic farmer, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know Stewart through various initiatives across the prairies. Stewart is very active in the agricultural community. He's vice president of the Western Grains Research Foundation. He is past president and very active still in the National Farmers Union. And so, Stewart, welcome to Brandon, Manitoba today. Thank you very much for taking the time to prepare your talk and to help answer questions. So when Stewart is done, I'm going to introduce our second farmer, who's Scott Beaton. So I'm going to now shift it over to Stewart. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Martin, and thanks very much to the organizers for the invitation. I've got about 20 slides that I'm going to try to get through in roughly 20 minutes, because I always think that question periods are important and valuable. And so I'll launch right into the presentation. Now I've got a Okay, I guess I should get some feedback if as to whether people can see the
It looks good,
presentation.
Stewart. It looks really good right now. Go ahead.
Okay. So water limited organic systems. I have to say that I've never lived or farmed in anything except a water limited system. We weren't always certified organic, but that happened in the early 90s. And so I've now been farming longer in an organic system than a non-organic system, which I was in from roughly 1970 to 1991. And as for the water limited part, my uncle, who has long since passed away, would always say, you know, we could really produce here if we just had enough water. So our farm is located on territory covered by Treaty 4. We're about 30 kilometers east of Swift Current, and we're in the heart of the Palliser Triangle. Our annual precipitation is in the neighborhood of 14 inches, 350 millimeters, but you wouldn't actually know it from this next slide. That's the mothership about to draw up our farmyard. If you can see my cursor on the screen, you can't actually see our house in this picture because it's nestled right in between these two hills. And on not most, but several of these hilltops on both sides of the valley that we live in, there are still the stone rings, the teepee rings that were left there by the people who were, you know, here before Treaty 4. So usually our biggest adversary is evapotranspiration, which is a term that I became familiar with. It's almost 50 years ago now that I was in engineering college in Saskatchewan. And in the ag engineering department, which no longer exists, we spent a lot of time talking about evapotranspiration, which of course is just a combination of evaporation and transpiration by plants. So I kind of approached this presentation asking the question, what can we control when it comes to evapotranspiration? What can farmers actually control? So I've got 6 points here. I'm only going to spend much time on the first 4, but we can increase snow capture, we can increase moisture retention, we can try to decrease evaporation and decrease transpiration. And then the time of seeding and the call for this acronym CFRA, we will only get to if we have time. So looking at point number 1 individually, increasing snow capture, we can have tree rows, which for those of you that might not be from the heart of the Palliser Triangle around Swift Current, you have to realize that every tree around here has been planted by someone. There's just no natural tree growth here in the heart of the Palliser Triangle. And so tree rows are essential, although they're being ripped out by the hundreds and thousands of miles each year now, which I think is very problematic. There is an option to plant perennial strips of perennial wheatgrass in fields to aid with the snow capture. And of course, there's always advantages and disadvantages to each one of these options that I'm going to talk about, but for the tree rows and the perennial wheatgrass strips, you need to think about your machinery width and try to match your machinery width to your to the width of your tree rows or wheatgrass strips. And of course, that's a little hard to do because machinery comes in all sorts of different sizes, and as you collect it over the years, you don't often start out thinking that about trying to match each machine. And the third one I have on this slide is just leaving higher stubble, which naturally can attract a lot more moisture. When you get to the point where you're leaving a really nice high stubble, either by just straight cutting high or using a stripper header, you may end up with a stubble problem in the spring. And on occasion, when I've experimented with this, I've had to go out with a swather before I could seed the next spring. So there's another issue, another problem that develops if you end up with stubble that's much too high. This is a picture of one of the tree rows that was planted on our farm back around 1970. And of course, before the federal government destroyed the tree nursery at Indian Head, all these trees were free. The rural municipalities all had equipment that you could use for free because everybody understood the value of tree rows and snow trapping. So this picture was taken yesterday, and you can see we don't have much snow, but it's obvious to see that little gap that we do have in this row of Caraganas and how there's just, absolutely nothing there, whereas beside it, there's at least something. In the history of that tree nursery at Indian Head, there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 575 million trees that were distributed out of that tree nursery for free before it was destroyed. So increasing moisture retention. Summer fallow has received there's a really negative connotation to summer fallow, and for good reason. There's pros and cons in both ways, but summer fallow was something that was always used here around Swift Current, and then it gradually morphed away from black summer fallow to conservation tillage type summer fallow, where people were trying to leave trash on top of the ground as much as possible. That evolved then into chem summer fallow, which evolved into no-till operations made possible by the use of glyphosate. And so I've said here in this top row that summer fallow equals the 26.3% solution. So for my entire life, we've been summer following in one way or another on this farm we're the third generation on this farm now, was homesteaded by my grandparents. And I have never heard this 26.3% number until I was reading a doctoral thesis this last week. And it turns out between the years 1922 and 1942, there was a lot of work done at the Dominion Experimental Farm here at Swift Current in conjunction with the PFRA after it was formed in 1935. And they determined that the amount of moisture that you could save in that summer fallow year was 26.3% of your total precipitation in that year. I have no idea if this number has been validated or updated since conservation tillage started in the 1980s, 1990s, but this is the only time I've ever seen it quantified. Now, 26.3% might not sound like a lot, but if you're talking about annual precipitation of 14 or 15 inches, you're talking about at least a quarter of that. So let's say 3 inches, between 3 and 4 inches. In this country here, that might be enough, that following year, the year following the summer fallow, to make the difference between actually getting some crop and getting no crop. And we've got to keep in mind always that the people who developed the summer following techniques and the techniques for trying to farm in this dryland circumstance around here, there were no government programs, there was no crop insurance, there was no agri-stability, no agri-invest. Getting something off of those fields each year determined whether that farm stayed or went bankrupt and just disappeared. And so when it came to this year, for instance, on a field that we had summer followed last year, we ended up with a yield of some 14 bushels the acre of spring wheat, which was, I mean, that's not great, but it was something. Our neighbor, who is one of the best chemical farmers in the area, has pristine looking fields, pristine looking crops, maximizes the use of chemical and fertilizer in order to maximize production. His yield on the other side of the road was four bushels to the acre. And the only reason I'm pointing that out is that back in those times, before crop insurance, before agri-stability, all that kind of thing, that difference between the 14 bushels the acre and the 4 bushels to the acre was really meaningful. So one of the things that happened coming out of the 1940s and 1950s, and this idea of that was really when the idea, people started moving away from the black summer fallow, because for 5 or 6 decades, starting in the late 1800s, people had decided, and the best science at the time said the best summer fallow was to have a dust mulch, absolutely black, nothing growing, but a dust mulch on top of the ground. That then, after the dirty 30s, after a lot of soil drifting, that turned, people started to turn away from that and understood they needed to try to keep some trash on top of that ground. And one of the machines that was invented to enable that was the Noble blade. And so here's a Noble blade that came out of the 1950s and 1960s. This is the Noble blade that I started to farm with when around 69 and 1970, when I really started driving farm equipment. I was in grade 10. That's 21 feet. Whether you're in field position or transport, it's still 21 feet. So this is the Noble blade that we use quite a bit at the moment. It's still essentially the same design, but wider and not quite as independent. Each blade is not as independent on this one as it was on the old ones. But this one here is 56 feet wide, and it cuts 49 feet. But it does exactly the same thing using these wide blades. So on this blade, these are 6 feet wide across the back end, and the angle at the front end is 90 degrees. There were blades available that were 110 degrees, so a little flatter design. But the key to anything about a Noble blade was it would cut under the weeds, under the ground, however deep you wanted to set it, and so it was the most low disturbance machine that was available, and pretty much still is. Now that has its advantages and disadvantages as well, of course. It's a machine made for working in relatively dry ground, hot sunny conditions. If the weather is wet, this blade will only kill tap-rooted weeds if the weather is wet, or if you get a rain the same day that you're using this blade. A lot of surface weeds will just regrow because the soil disturbance just isn't high enough. So this is a field of ours that was bladed. This was a lentil field this year in 2021. I bladed it late in the year in September because that was the only time we got any rain this year, was in the middle of harvest. So the lentils had already been harvested, had been straight cut, but there was regrowth of wild oats, and there's Canada thistle on most of these fields. And so this was worked once with that noble blade, but you can see how almost all of the trash, some 80 to 90% of the trash, is left right on top of the field to provide some cover between now and next spring. Same thing with this field. This field was actually worked 3 times this year. Just straight black summer fallow, no legumes or anything seeded on it as a plow down crop. And it has lots of trash to carry it through the winter to get it through to next spring. Freeze thaw is always a worry here because it breaks down the surface of the soil. And when you get into April and May, that's when we have a lot of an extra amount of wind. So then we can try to decrease evaporation. You get back to the trees and barriers, taller stubble, less tillage instead of more tillage, and earlier seeding, of course, can be an advantage depending on the year. We can try to decrease transpiration. Some crops naturally use less water, like lentils and peas and mustard. That's why lentils are such a valuable crop in this part of the world. And you can always decrease transpiration by trying to control weeds. And it turns out there are thistles for all seasons. And our wet weather thistle is, of course, Canada thistle. Our dry weather thistle is Russian thistle. And Russian thistle has made a real comeback in this part of the world the last 2 to 3 years, not just in organic regimes, but also in chemical regimes. And I can understand now why Russian thistle was such an important crop to the farmers like my dad in the 1930s, who cut and baled Russian thistle to try to overwinter livestock. Russian thistle loves heat and it loves dry. And I don't know how it germinates or how it grows, but it's very successful. So when it comes to the row cropping piece, I just want to speak briefly, and it looks like I'm approaching 90 minutes here right now, but I want to speak just briefly to, and I'm not sure why.
This may not work if it's a video.
I wanted to change my, yeah, what I'm trying to do is change my screen to get back to my computer screen.
Is it a video that you would like to show, Stewart?
Oh, yeah, here we go. I think this is going to work here. Just a second. And I'm not going to spend the full 4 minutes on this, but most of you have probably seen these inter-row cultivators. And this year was our first year trying to use one of these camera-guided cultivators. And I just wanted to show you a couple of things that we were attempting to do. So when I was talking about machinery widths, we purchased this machine in a 45-foot width because that was exactly the same as the old Flexicoil drill that we're currently using. And I wanted to do that so that we could actually follow exactly the drill and follow the exact direction of the drill. I'm just going to actually back this up a little bit here. Okay. I want to do that because on our old Flexicoil drill, it's really hard to change this spacing and get the spacing identical on the seed runs. But on this camera-guided cultivator, it's very easy to change the distance. And so I thought I'd be better off to change the spacing as required to try to get these small sweeps to run in between the rows rather than spend a lot of unsuccessful time trying to make the drill match this cultivator. The other thing I wanted to say about this machine was I did a fair bit of research before we bought this last year, and I couldn't find one other person that had actually tied a Garford cultivator onto an articulating four-wheel drive tractor. And I was a bit worried about whether it was actually going to work or not, but it seemed to be fine. It seemed to work. We did add this option here. These coulters are optional. It was an option to help stabilize it a little bit at the back end, but actually I was pretty happy with it. I ended up calling it sort of a miracle machine on two fronts. One of the miracles was it actually seemed to work, and it could find the rows and more or less stay in between the rows. The other miracle was, and I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but my cursor is pointing at these small stones. It can find every single small stone you have and leave it right on top of the ground, which means if you're going to, I'm sure that I could just never use it any place where I was going to try to use a flex header in the fall, which, you know, limits its usefulness a little bit, but still, we've only got 1 year's experience with it, and it might not have been the best year, but I was relatively happy with it. I'm going to stop it just once more. I blocked off one seed run right here in the middle of the drill, and that's my tram line for trying to make sure that I'm lined up in the right spot. That's all I wanted to say about that drill, and so I'm going to go back now, try to get back to the original place here, and just a couple of other pieces. Timing of seeding, of course, is important, but there's also insect considerations if you don't have enough water. And specifically, I'm talking about grasshoppers. Grasshoppers love heat and dry, just exactly the same as Russian thistle. And there's some sort of intercropping and row cropping and barrier strips, especially with peas, that you can use to try to mitigate some grasshopper damage. And you know, I think sometimes they're at least a bit successful. And I just wanted to mention the quest that I'm on at the moment, which is trying to convince the federal government to institute something, build an agency called the Canadian Farm Resiliency Agency, which I think we all need, whether we're organic farmers or non-organic farmers. Going into this time of a wider variability and volatility in the climate, I think this isn't strictly a recreation of the PFRA, the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, but in my mind, it would be something similar that could use demonstration farms and demonstration facilities to help farmers through the intercropping and all of the different things that we might have to adjust in order to try to maintain our presence here in the Palliser Triangle. And I'll just end on the note that there was serious discussion here amongst governments just before the formation of the PFRA in 1935. They were seriously considering evacuating 300,000 people, mostly farmers, out of the Palliser Triangle because they were just worried that it couldn't sustain any sort of agricultural production. Thank you very much. That's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Stewart. That was really terrific. I think there's probably lots of questions. What we're going to do is go to our next guest farmer, and then at the end of Scott's talk, we'll get questions for everybody. So again, thank you very much for that wisdom, and just a wonderful well-organized presentation with, you know, really good ideas. Our next farmer is Scott Beaton. Scott, if you want to turn your camera on, you go ahead. Scott is farming near Winnipeg, Manitoba in the Rosser area. And you probably had a chance to read the bio on Scott as well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but he's been farming organically since about 2007 or 8. And if I got that wrong, he'll correct me. So Scott, welcome. Scott is also involved in Grain on the Brain, so you may already know him. So Scott, we are all yours. Thank you very much for participating. And you're muted. You're muted. You're muted, Scott.
I was just making a bunch of wise ass comments, so it's best that I was muted then. Thanks, Martin. I started farming myself in 2008, and it took me a few years to get myself sorted out. And I think my first organic crop was 2012, if I remember correctly, so you're not far off. I'm going to see if I can make this presentation work here and get going. Thanks very much, and I'll try and touch on a lot of the things Stewart spoke about. I've got more pictures, and Stewart's better with words than I am, so I'm just going to show you some stuff that we've been doing and trying, and show you the things that aren't working and talk about them a little bit. But yeah, we'll go through here. And thanks very much, Stewart. I think you introduced the principles well, and I think I can maybe expand upon some of the stuff that he spoke about. So as Martin said, I farm close to Winnipeg area, and I am fortunate in that I guess I have some land that is Red River Valley, heavy clay soil, that is relatively elastic in terms of its ability to deal with a drought. And so we had a little bit of a crop there this year, and then I have some land up north of Stonewall that's on a lighter soil near some limestone gravel pits, and it's kind of a sandy loam mix that doesn't do well when it doesn't rain. And so we'll look at both of them and kind of try and compare some of the pros and cons of each of those and how we're managing them differently. So I just farm a section. Organic grain production has been the focus for the last, I guess, 8 to 10 years on that farm. We grow a mix of cereals and oil seeds, and grow a little bit of peas and fava beans as part of the rotation. And I've recently, I guess in the last 3 years, moved to try and finish some grass-finished beef as a part of the rotation on part of the farm. The goals for the farm, I guess, are to try and improve soil over time, provide ecological goods and services, and grow and produce good food. I don't like buying inputs, and so I guess that's maybe pushed me in the direction of organic farming, and I think the way that I looked at it when I started is very, very different than the way that I look at it now. And we'll get into that as we go here. And I guess the same with energy. I don't like buying energy. I think the sun has lots of it, and if we can use that sun, we can drive a lot of the system that we need to make our farm work. So as I said, I've got 2 different kind of farm units. Both are a half section. They're about 25 miles apart, and both have, I guess, some unique challenges and opportunities that present themselves. So my Rosser farm is on the heavy soil, Red River Valley type of stuff that you would think of. It's black and it's sticky oftentimes. More often too wet than too dry, although the last couple of years has really tested that. these pictures, the top picture is a little bit of an older one, but we've been trying to seed early, take advantage of some moisture, and then grow a later seeded cover crop whenever possible, as a means to use up some moisture and improve trafficability in the spring, that when it's usually a problem. So that's what's going on in the top picture here. It's helped with pest control in terms of managing weeds and things of that nature. Just having something growing and taking up that space seems to really help in managing some of the weeds that want to take hold otherwise. And that production unit is kind of divided these days. It's about half hayfield and half cropland, and every 2 or 3 years I flip it, and so one quarter goes one way and the other way. I've got access to dairy manure nearby. That's been a good relationship that we've kind of developed, and so I'm not too scared of removing too much fertility through exporting bales. And when I do export bales, they usually, or a lot of them, end up going to my other piece, where I'm importing fertility, I guess, there in the form of that hay that I'm going to feed to these calves over wintertime. So this is the other piece, as I said, sandy loam soil, and this piece I've farmed since 2012. I think I started on that half section, and since that time it's been, I've never seen it where it's too wet. It's quite dry as a general rule, and so we're trying to conserve moisture wherever we get the chance there. I guess, as I said earlier, I switched to being an organic farmer as an economic, I guess, decision more than anything else. I was tired of spending money on inputs and selling to an elevator and making pennies on the dollar in terms of my margin every year, and just watching that margin decline at a prairie-wide scale. And so it made sense to try and do something different, and I've quite enjoyed, I guess, this whole journey that I could call being an organic farmer, because it just makes you look at things so differently. As I said, we got into calves. I started custom grazing about 3 years ago. We've bought our own calves at this point, and keep some of our own, and have continued to custom graze with some friends that have really helped out to make it all work, and to make help me to learn about animal production that was never really on my radar before. I think the diversity is a real strength of an organic farm, and if you're able to embrace the diversity, it really helps to manage those highs and lows in terms of moisture that kind of come and go throughout a year. The bottom one, I guess, I'm fortunate in that I farm in these two areas, and am able to see both sides. And I also work for a conservation agency called Manitoba Habitat, where I work on carbon projects and grazing systems and wetland restoration type work. And it really helps me to, I spend a lot of time talking to people and seeing the countryside, and I think it gives me a lot of perspective in some of the challenges people face. And so I watch all my neighbors drain all their land. I've never dug a ditch in my life, and I think that whatever water lands on my land, I want to infiltrate it and keep it there and use it later. And so I guess that's been a real area that I work on a regular basis. And so this is what that parcel at Balmoral, kind of the rotation looks like. There's a couple years of crop, usually a year of green manure that's either mowed or hayed or grazed, and then 2 or 3 or more years of pasture, kind of all mixed in. And that, I think, it's played on the diversity. It's left me with a lot of options in terms of what I can do, and it lets me manage the moisture as it comes and goes through the cycles. And we've been in quite a dry cycle for the last few years, and so that's kind of helped. So I think I spoke about all this, and I don't think this will be new to this crowd, but the green manure, I guess, yeah, helps to add diversity, break those pest cycles, grow more carbon that I think improves my resiliency that Stewart talked about over time. If we can increase our organic matter in our soils, we can infiltrate moisture when we get it and use it up later rather than watch it go down the ditch and to the lake. Stewart spoke about tall stubble, and that's been something, I guess, that we've been working on lately to a great degree, is trying to trap some snow in the winter. And it's a challenge in an organic system where you want to do some tillage. And so we've been growing some winter cereals, trying to leave tall stubble, trying to broadcast in clover kind of mix that can allow us to deal with our green manure phase, try and use less moisture in this system. So we're using a red clover, Alsike clover blend in the Balmoral area where we're water limited, and we're using more of an alfalfa grass type of mixture in Rosser, where usually we've got enough moisture that we can deal with the deficit that the alfalfa is going to create. So here's that alfalfa mix. So yeah, we usually will try and establish this underneath a cereal crop and keep it in for 2 or 3 years before it gets terminated. And the areas where we had alfalfa in our lighter soils were a real challenge this year in terms of growing a crop. And it became very apparent that we need to be careful with our transpiration, the volume of water that we're using in years prior, because there was just no reserve left to grow a crop. So I've showed you a lot of pictures of green stuff, and I guess I wanted to share that it's not always the case. We do some tillage, just as Stewart showed. The noble blade that I have access to is only 1 blade wide, so 5 or 6 feet at a time. I don't get too far, but it is enough that gives me the opportunity to try some of that, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Stewart spoke about stones, and if I pull up all the stones with my tillage equipment, then you can't see the soil anymore. There's so many in a lot of spots. So we watch that a little bit, but we do some tillage when we need to. And this is the tool that we've been using to establish some of the small seeds. This is in a fall rye crop. You can see the leaves aren't even on the trees yet, so it's early May when this picture was taken. And we usually try and get out there and get that seed in the ground and get it a little bit buried. And I've had relatively good luck, I guess, with this system. Stewart mentioned crop insurance, and I haven't been a big believer in crop insurance. I think it's been a great thing for farming as a whole, but it definitely limits your ability to do some different things. And I guess for me, intercropping has been quite important. And the ability to use intercrops under even the new Manitoba crop insurance model to me is still very, very limited, and so I haven't taken much crop insurance in the last 10 years. The exception has been when trying to establish some forages, and this year I took insurance and I made a claim on every acre that I did. And I think I was just quite nervous about how dry it was going into this spring, so I felt the need to do that. As I said, intercrops have been quite important. A lot of the grain acres that I'm growing have some sort of intercrop in them, and that's been my crop insurance for the last few years. In a dry year, we've been mixing peas and oats, some flax and wheat, peas and mustard have been another one, and it seems like it's been a good way to manage those extremes in moisture one way or another. If you've got two species, one that does well in the wet and one does well in the dry, usually you can do okay. Stewart, I guess, is lucky in that he knows that I forget what he called it, but his enemy was evapotranspiration. We seem to go through cycles at home, and so we have a pretty good idea, I think, in the spring which way you're going to be worried this year, but I've been surprised in the past, so those intercrops definitely help to take some of the risk out. This is just a picture of my intercrop cleaning setup. So I usually spend a few weeks in the winter cleaning out things, and so this was a pea oat mix that it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it's effective enough that I can take both of those crops to the elevator and they don't complain too much. So we'll see. I don't think I need to show this. It's just a video of the cleaner cleaning, so I will advance past it if I can figure out how. There we are. And this was another, just an example of an intercrop. So this was peas and mustard seeded together and actually underseeded with a alfalfa clover grass mix that worked very well. We've only done this once, but I think we will try it again the next time we seed pea mustard intercrop. It seemed like a good place to start some forage. There was a little bit of space down below in the canopy, and weed control was excellent. We straight cut that crop and worked well. Some new projects. So Stewart spoke about Shelterbelts that I think are very valuable in trying to spread that snow load over the field rather than watch it all drift on the far fence line. We've planted, so we started planting some Shelterbelts in 2016 and have done a few more, or a row or so, almost every year since. So we've got a few kind of breaking up that piece where we are limited by moisture. I spoke about bringing the livestock in 2019, so we've done that for 3 years now. And I think it's been a good way to kind of spread some risk out, do some different things, and a good management tool for dealing with some of the cropping challenges that have come up. These pictures here are, the bottom one might be hard to see, but we put in a 3-inch water line, about 8,000 feet of it, that runs down the middle of the half section near Balmoral. And it serves as both my livestock water system, so we move animals every day or two through the summer, and they are followed immediately behind by an irrigation system that we can put on about 1.5 inches of water on that paddock that they just grazed in the 24 hours before they move to the next paddock. And the thought has been to try and really drive, so they're usually grazing either a perennial or a annual green manure. And I think that if we can really drive the growth and the production of that phase of the rotation, that hopefully we can improve our soils quicker and be able to manage or infiltrate more water on the whole farm throughout time, and use that to try and drive our crop production system is the thought process. And I don't know if I'm right or wrong yet, because we set this up. So last year we plowed the line in, and then this year was the first year using the sprinklers, and it was a great thing because we had adequate pasture for most of the year. And actually the cows are out grazing still today, which we fed some bales in August for about 3 weeks. We were feeding bales to try and stockpile some forage for now. And so that's been a good thing that it's worked out, because we're not too long on feed there, and the feed prices make it hard to put too much into my own calves. So this is the perennial phase. Looks like this. They get about 1.5 acres or so a day, and that gives us the speed necessary to move across the field in the way that we need to. So we're moving fence and water, and then the sprinklers pretty much every day or two to make this system work, and it's been working well. And I noticed a lot less of what was going on before I had the animals. I think you make yourself busy in the tractor, and it's not that you're not observing, but you're not out there every day for a half an hour or an hour moving animals around. And I find the experience is very different, and I quite enjoy that part of my day, where I think that always looked like it would be a chore in the past, but that's usually my favorite part of the day now is moving animals around. So it's been a good thing. The bales that we make in Ross are half to 2/3 of them end up coming to Balmoral on the lighter soil, and we bale graze our kind of the higher ridges or our poorer areas. So I'll pick 10 or 15 acres every year, as this is where we're going to do our bale grazing. We move a wire once a week or so through the winter to give them access to the next row of bales that have been set out before when I'm prepared. And this year that'll be set out in the next couple of weeks because I wasn't. But so yeah, they're still grazing at the moment. So it's been a forgiving year, I guess, for us. And this picture in the bottom is what that looks like in the spring. So we get huge residue cover, lots of manure spread, and that's been the best 10 acres on the farm for the last couple of years when we've been doing it. And I think we'll see those effects long enough that I can get around that whole half section and come back to the first spot again and still be seeing that benefit. And I've seen that through a few friends that have been doing this bale grazing and using the livestock as a management tool for a little while. I pay quite close attention to I guess the regenerative ag type community, and I think they're doing some really interesting stuff, and a lot of it I think will help to manage water deficit in annual cropping systems. So I think that's a good place to look if you're quite interested in this sort of stuff. This is a picture of that Shelterbelt. I think this was 2017. We had planted, so we planted 2 rows in 2016, 2 rows in 2017, and then I think a row in 18, and we've done a couple other rows elsewhere since. And this was research done by a fella at Indian Head, and yeah, showed, I guess, the extra crop that can be produced adjacent to Shelterbelt, and I think this was all based on the extra, like the moisture that was saved is what made the difference in this, if you read the details of this study. And so this chart shows for wheat, and wheat isn't overly responsive because I think it's been bred to deal with a very arid environment for years and years. So yeah, we had 190 field years in this study, and you got about 8% more wheat over the area of the field. But if you look at some of the other crops that we're growing, you can get twice as much alfalfa because you've got more moisture. Barley 25% more, winter wheat another quarter more. So it's quite significant if you can save that moisture, and so that's, I think, why we keep moving to more and more shelter belts. That's that same shelter belt. So this picture was September of 2019, and it's quite a bit bigger and thicker now, but it's come a long way. It's a 5-row shelter belt. I followed the Ecobuffer model, and I've since been working on a project. We've through work at MHHC, we're planting a 3-row Ecobuffer that runs between kind of St. Francis and Portage la Prairie as a highways project. But yeah, there's lots of promise for this type of design, and it serves a pile of different functions. It's a wildlife corridor now. We actually let the calves in and grazed it this year to clean up some of the grass in the bottom and encourage some a little bit of thinning down below and get the trees aiming up a little bit higher. But yeah, it's been quite a nice project and looks very nice now. I worked with the Conservation District on a few different projects. This was one operation, Pollinator. We had a little 7-acre piece in the corner of that Balmoral. They call it the Balmoral Triangle because things go up there and never come back. But this piece, we hadn't been cropped for years and years because it was kind of an awkward piece to get at and get to, and so we seeded it down to mix, grazed it this year as well. And yeah, so there's lots of work that's been done or can be done through the conservation districts. So I think this was the last slide I had. And I guess, yeah, I put a lot of effort into maintaining biodiversity and different habitats in close proximity throughout that parcel of land. This stretch here is an area we were getting ready to seed to a shelter belt 2 years ago. So we had planted, it was a multi-species cover crop along the fence line, and we worked it under and planted, we've got a 2-row shelter belt in here now up the middle of this field that's divided that quarter into, or this, I guess it was a 100-acre field into 2 50-acre parcels now. And the picture of the fence line that you saw, or the water line going in earlier, was right in the same area. So the water line runs along the fence line, and we can water animals or sprinkle going out from either side. And our tree line runs up the same area so as to not disturb traffic and that sort of thing to too great a degree. So I hope I covered most of the stuff that we wanted to talk about, and yeah, we've got time for questions, so feel free to ask away.